Greetings and salutations, friends. Now, this will of course be the video about the Orcs and Goblins army, but before that, a quick announcement. I have said in response to a few requests that I will be making a video on Black Library, the publishing arm for books pertaining to the Warhammer and 40k universe. Now, this will be a relatively quick video, just explaining what the Black Library is and what kind of books you can expect to see there, with a couple of personal recommendations. I am doing this in collaboration with Grey Hunter over at Gaming Shenanigans, as he is another fellow Warhammer fan, and he's also doing some lore videos on the presumably upcoming Total War Warhammer, so definitely go check him out. I've added a little bit of a link to his page in the description, so yeah, definitely go give him a look. I have entered into a bit of an unofficial collaboration with him when it comes to Total War Warhammer, so you'll probably be seeing him around every now and then. Anyways, Orcs and Goblins. Now, as to how the Orcs and Goblins fight, I will cover that in a separate tactics video, so here will just be the units, and we start out with the generals in the form of the Orc War Boss. Now, the Orc Boss is your quintessential Orc army leader. He comes in both Lord and Hero forms, and can be mounted on a Chariot, a boar, and a wyvern. He doesn't quite have the killing power of the Savage Orc Boss, or the animosity quelling of the Black Orc, but he is considerably cheaper, which allows you to take him as a bit of a combat unit in a larger army. Stick this guy on a wyvern, for example, and you have a very, very potent combat unit, without necessarily making him the army's main general. Now, already there I mentioned animosity, which you probably don't have any previous knowledge of, so I'll quickly touch upon that before I go any further with the heroes. Animosity is the Orcs and Goblins' special ability, so to say, or their special racial trait. It represents the fact that even in a fairly cooperative horde, the Orcs and Goblins are never friends. And not just the Orcs and Goblins. An Orc does not particularly like most other Orcs, just as most Goblins do not particularly like most other Goblins. And this is represented in-game by an animosity chart. Every turn, you roll a dice, and on a certain score, the unit has to roll on the animosity chart, where anything could happen. The unit could charge towards the enemy, screaming their lungs out and getting a bit of a charging bonus. The unit might squabble. The members of the unit might start arguing and beating the shit out of each other and be unable to move. Or, presuming the unit has ranged weapons, they might decide to fire upon another unit of orcs, because someone in that unit gave someone in the archer unit a middle finger or something along those lines. Now, in a Total War game, the current animosity table is probably a bit too random to be implemented directly into Total War. Like, you can imagine if some of your units just suddenly decided to stop following orders, or your archers started to just pepper your own dudes from behind, etc. That could potentially be quite game-breaking. However, you can't completely remove animosity because it is such a huge part of the Greenskin army. What I propose is that the Greenskins, much like the Skavens, get access to a ton of character slots. When you start the game, it's not just your family member, because, well, Orcs don't really have families, they reproduce via spores, and so they have no family structure. But essentially, you start out not with just your leading war boss and a couple of his closest cronies, you start out with your leading war boss and a couple dozen orcs under you, consisting of orc bosses, which you can then later on raise up into black orc bosses, for example. And of course some goblins as well, that you can raise into goblin bosses, goblin shamans, that kind of thing. And what you could do with this is that whenever a unit is within the command radius of one of your generals, they are immune to an animosity test. So if there's a unit that next to the unit that contains your orc boss, for example, the unit that contains your orc boss, as well as the units next to him, will be immune to animosity. Whereas any unit that is outside his area of influence, so to say, might disobey orders, they might charge off against the enemy, they might refuse to move, and they might decide to fire upon their allies. All of these things could happen. And here's the thing. If we assume that the Orcs and Goblins gets to have lots of characters, and we assume that the general does not necessarily have to be his own unit, so that you can have the general attached to the army and then assign him to a unit in the army, either before the battle begins or upon battle deployment. This means that the average Orc and Goblin army, consisting of circa 20 units for example, should contain 5 or 6 generals, quote-unquote, or faction members, so to say, to act as stabilizing presences. Now, only one of these characters will be your actual general, so to say. Only one of them will actually have the general special abilities, whatever they may be. But the other faction members are essentially there as special characters that have their own area of influence. So in an ideal world, you want the entirety of your line to be covered by your generals, so that at the beginning of the battle, there should be no chance whatsoever of animosity. However, as the battle proceeds, your units are getting a bit strung out, animosity starts happening. Or if some of your faction members get killed, animosity starts happening. Or if you send a unit of cavalry off on a flank without someone leading them, animosity starts happening. You see? It's a bit of a risk-reward kind of thing. You could kit out that Orc war boss, put him on the Wyvern, give him a big-ass magical axe and some serious kick-ass armor, and send him hurtling into the enemy ranks, but that's likely to take him out of command range of some units. And maybe then the unit of Orcs who were going to back him up decides to squabble instead, doesn't charge, and now your big bad general is just surrounded by a dozen enemy units. Now, of course, this is mere speculation and would require a fair bit of in-game testing to see if this is even a possible solution. But as for this video, I am more or less going to assume that they're going to do something along these lines, just so I have a framework to work with. And personally, I don't think it's that bad of an idea. I definitely think you could make it work, and it would allow you to retain a bit of what makes the Orcs and Goblins special. Because while you could completely remove animosity, and that would certainly be the easiest way out, you're not really playing an Orc and Goblins army at that point, you know? I wouldn't be too disappointed if they took it out. I understand the reason, but I'd kinda like for them to put in the effort, so to say. Anyways, after the Orc war boss, we have the Savage Orc boss. Now, the Savage Orcs are essentially a, not a subspecies so much as a different faction within Orc society. They live separated from the vast majority of their brethren, and haven't developed any real bond with the goblins. Therefore, they don't really have any real way of crafting weapons or armor. And many of the savage orcs themselves view fancy, useless things, such as metal weapons and armor, as little more than useless decoration, preferring instead to rely on the magic of their shamans to protect them. This extremely basic existence, comparable to our own Stone Age, has bred a particularly nasty, vicious and violent breed of orcs, which we now know as Savage Orcs. And, therefore, being a race that only respects strength and ferocity, a Savage Orc boss is the biggest and the baddest and the craziest of a bunch of crazy big bastards. And so he's got considerably more killing potential than your average Orc boss. But on the other hand, he is also frenzied, which means that he's not really that controllable. In Total War terms, it would basically be the same as when a unit can charge without orders, except this guy would charge without orders a lot more frequently. And due to his savage nature, he should have a smaller zone of control than your average Orc boss, so if you want him in your army for that extra killing power, you're going to have to risk some more animosity tests to do it. Now, on the other hand, you have the Black Orc boss. A black orc is an orc that has been fighting and battling and growing for a considerable amount of time, to the point where his skin has started to become so tough and so thick that it has taken on a deep, darkish green color. Additionally, they usually wear extremely crude yet effective armor created from black plate. Essentially slabs of iron or any nearby material rudely fashioned into a very basic suit of armor. And while it lacks the intricate design of Empire plate mail, with lots of curved shapes to deflect blows rather than simply absorb them, an orc is strong enough to simply wear slabs of metal and rely on sheer thickness to protect him. Additionally, the black orcs are a little bit more intelligent than your average orc, though not by a massive amount, and are seen upon as leaders by the rest of orc society. Therefore, a black orc warboss has in tabletop a special rule named Quell Animosity, where any unit he is in, if it were to normally have an animosity reaction, the black orc goes around and bashes a few heads and gets the unit back in line. As such, in Total War terms, he should have a much larger zone of control than the Orc boss or the Savage Orc boss. He's also a fair bit bigger than your average Orc boss, so he is pretty damn handy in a fight. And if equipped with the proper magical items, is of course a right monster. Then, moving on to the Goblin boss, you have two varieties with a normal Goblin and a Night Goblin, which doesn't make too much of a difference. They're still essentially Goblin leaders. They have considerably less leadership than their Orc cousins, and they're not as good in a fight, of course. But they can ride giant squigs, making them the only general who can hop along with a unit of squig hoppers. And being far cheaper than your average orc boss, can be deployed in considerably larger numbers, and while their zone of control should be considerably smaller than that of the orc boss or the black orc or even the savage orc, you should be able to field a fair bit more of them. Then there is the orc shaman that provides the magical powers of the orcish force, that wield the powers of the big warg, the orcish lore of magic primarily focused on damaging spells, and that is something they're pretty damn good at. They have some fairly devastating AoE spells, but again, they are orcs and therefore their spells have a fair bit of chance of backfiring. Much in the same way that Skaven weaponry is extremely devastating when used properly and with just a bit of luck, the Orc Shaman also requires a bit of finesse in his application and just a little bit of luck as well. Otherwise, he is essentially a basic wizard that should be implemented in Total War, either as an artillery piece or as a unit capable of casting specialized magic, essentially, depending on which way they go. And depending on which way they go, they should also have different misfire charts. If he has the ability to cast specific spells, like for example a buffing spell or a Foot of Gork and such on things, his misfires should probably be tied to the spell that he was trying to cast. Whereas if they make him a simple artillery piece, he should probably be more or less free from miscast, simply because he doesn't quite have the versatility, and just watching one of your artillery units technically just blow up and kill all of your own units due to miscasts, a little annoying. So I'm not going to speculate too much on how they're going to implement magic, for the simple fact that I don't have the faintest. So instead I will move on to the Goblin Shaman with the lore of the Little Warg. Very detailed descriptions for the orc magic there, I know. The Little and the Big Warg. The Little Warg focuses on various hexes and essentially specializes in annoying the ever-living shit out of enemy units, rather than outright killing them. So, the Goblin Shamans are considerably less destructive outright than their orc cousins. However, they are also considerably cheaper, which should allow you to take way more of them. If they implement a magic system where, for example, you have cards with special magical effects that can be used for each shaman, for example, Having one Orc Shaman for that offensive spell power could be an interesting thing, and equally so, having several Goblin Shamans for more or less the same costs, casting several weaker but potentially more interesting spells as they stack up, could be a pretty cool mechanic. So, with the leaders out of the way, let's move on to the core units, where we start, of course, with your standard Orc boys. Your bread and butter unit. Orcs are tough, have a pretty decent stat line, and are relatively cheap at only 6 points a model. So you're going to get 3 Skaven slaves for each orc, and can thereby be fielded in considerable numbers and are quite useful as a hoardy, slowy, downy unit, as you can deploy enough of them to turn them into a bit of a meat shield, while they also have enough oomph in melee to make them relatively dangerous. Additionally, they have some options in their weapons loadouts, and I would like to see this represented in Total War by different unit types. Now, I'd love to be able to equip each and every unit in my army like I see fit, but that's probably a little bit complicated for a Total War game. So essentially I would like to see 3 different type of Orc boys, so to say, 3 different units. I'd like to see the standard Orc boy with sword and shield as a slightly tougher, more reliable unit, as it's able to eat more missile fire. I'd like to see a Orc boys with double choppers, 2 melee weapons, for a bit more of an oomph on the charge, and I'd of course like to see a unit of Orc boys with spears, just because that would give you a little bit of flexibility when it comes to dealing with enemy cavalry. Now, as for the unit itself, I am going to explain now the Orc Chopper. The chopper is the name that Orcs gives to their melee weapons. A chopper doesn't necessarily have to be an axe or the sword-like machete used normally by the Orcs. A chopper is essentially just a melee weapon, but the difference is it's usually a very, very large and heavy melee weapon, because the Orc is considerably stronger than your average human. He's capable of lifting a fairly considerable hunk of metal and using it as a weapon, and this gives them plus strength on the charge. In Total War, this should be represented by a unit of Orcs boys having a quite considerable charge statistic. Like, a unit of Orc boys is not going to win against a disciplined unit of Empire Spearmen in a straight-up brawly fight, because while the individual Orcs are stronger, they fight like individuals. So in all due likelihood, you'll have one Orc boy up against 3 Empire Spearmen, with 3 of them stabbing at him, and he has to fight his way through multiple ranks of spear to actually get at them. But in a charge, well, Orcs are extremely tough, and while you might be able to stab him once or even twice, his sheer weight and momentum is going to carry him forward into your unit, and once the formation of spearmen are broken, then the Orc boys are starting to fight one-on-one with their considerably smaller and weaker human counterparts. So, then we move on to the strange unit, Orc Arrow Boys, and that's Orcish for Orc Arrow Boys, so Orcs with bows. It's a little bit of a strange combination, as what self-respecting Orc would actually voluntarily stay out of melee combat? Now, the Orc bows themselves are shoddy in the extreme, and the Orcs firing them, well, they don't really give that much of a shit about actually hitting anything. They just enjoy the act of, firing their bows. However, Orc Arrow Boys are considerably cheaper than most other nations' ranged units, which means you can have considerably large blocks of them. So, while I forgot to mention the unit size for the Orc Boys, I think they should be 120, because, well, they're relatively standard infantry. The Orc Arrow Boys should come in horde size of 240. They should have atrocious accuracy and pretty damn low missile damage per individual arrow, but they should be able to absolutely just rain arrows down on their chosen target. making up for what they lack in individual quality and accuracy by sheer weight of fire. Now, being orcs, they are also considerably tougher in melee combat than your average arrow unit, although they're still not going to be standing up to proper infantry. If a unit of Skaven slaves somehow managed to wander their way through or around the orc lines, an orc Arab boys unit would probably be able to see them off without too much issue. And then, for something with even more melee oomph, we have the Savage Orc Boys. Now, you remember I mentioned this in the Savage Orc Boss part, but the Savage Orc Boys are, well, essentially batshit insane orcs. With extremely shoddy weapons and essentially no armor, and slightly more expensive to the standard Orc Boys, they come with frenzy and so should have an insane close combat statistic with a right proper charge. In essence, they are an Orc Boys unit of 120 models. They're just flat out better at combat with a bigger charge. However, as they don't have any armor, relying instead on the magic of their shamans to protect them by drawing all over them with blue paint, they're going to fall like absolute flies to any ranged weapon. So effective implementation of these guys in your battle line is going to require some shielding from incoming arrow fire. Next up we have the Orc Biggins. The big ones are a cheap upgrade to an Orc Boys unit in tabletop. However, in Total War I would prefer if Biggins were simply a unit, with the same variety as Orc Boys, except for spears, because, well, no self-respecting Biggin is going to be carrying around a spear. But having an option for a single chopper and a shield and dual melee weapons would be good. Now, the Biggins are relatively rare compared to orcs. They are essentially bigger, badder orcs that haven't quite grown to black orc status, and should in Total War's terms essentially just be bigger, badder orcs with a better stat line overall, and with a fair bit more armor. As they've been fighting for much longer, they've been able to gather up a lot more equipment that they can cobble together into relatively effective armor and weapons for themselves. Now, being relatively rare, the Total War Biggins should be somewhat limited. I would say that you should probably be able to recruit them as normal-ish, but they should be pretty damn expensive, and maybe you should put a limit on them per army, but I'm a bit conflicted on this unit, because on one hand I kinda want to limit them, on the other hand, in a Total War setting where you have these massive armies of units, I'm kinda thinking that, okay, if you've got the money to field an army of Biggins, then go ahead. So, I'm not entirely sure on that one. But if they do make them relatively easily recruitable, so to say, making them a tier 2 or 3 unit, then at least make them fairly expensive, yeah? Then on to something that's not expensive at all, your average Goblin. Now, the Goblins serve much the same role as the Skaven slaves serve for the Skaven army. They're essentially cannon fodder, used to absorb the charge of enemy units and eat tons of arrow fire. And in Total War terms, they should be just that, a unit of 240 goblins that's quite capable of eating a fair bit of arrow fire and slowing down the enemy. They're also decent enough flank protection units if you want to make sure that your precious unit of black orcs doesn't get a unit of knights slammed into its flank. Placing some goblins next to them to eat the charge is never a bad idea. The goblins also, of course, come in a mounted variety in the form of the Goblin Wolf Riders, the fast skirmish cavalry of your army. Now, the Goblin Wolf Riders are not particularly heavily armoured, but they are fairly potent in melee, seeing as they are, well, riding wolves. So in melee combat, they could probably take on most other light cavalry. The catch is, of course, that most light cavalry is actually faster than the Goblin Wolf Riders, as a wolf is going to have some problems keeping up with a horse for any length of time. So, primarily armed with bows, they are essentially a skirmishing, flanking type of unit, with the possibility of engaging quite a few of the old world's light cavalry units, as long as they can actually catch them. In all other respects, they are essentially basic light cavalry, so I'd probably say they should be limited to slightly more than heavy cavalry. If we say that heavy cavalry should be 60 models, I'd say these guys should probably weigh in at 80, maybe 90 or 100. Not so many as to make them a serious threat to infantry when they charge head-on, but enough to make them easily distinguishable from heavy cavalry. Speaking of light cavalry, we have the Forest Goblin Spider Riders. Spider Riders are a little bit interesting because they have poisoned arrow attacks. Now, exactly how they would implement poison in a Total War game, I am not entirely sure. I would like to have some kind of actual poison system where a model that is hit by a poisoned arrow and not killed gets, well, poisoned, and they have a hit points pool or something along those lines that gets ticked away by the poison. Could work. If that's too complicated, simply just give them a higher ranged attack per, well, arrow, essentially, than the normal archers. Yeah, that'll work relatively well anyways. Additionally, of course, they are riding spiders, which means they ignore most terrain, because, well, even a wall is not actually going to stop a spider, which has some really interesting implications for a Total War game. This could potentially be a unit that would be able to scale castle walls. And while that might sound like it could be utterly and completely broken, you've got to remember these are goblins riding the spiders. Giant spiders, yes, but they're still going to have a fairly hard time beating up a proper infantry unit. So even if they do get behind the walls, well, you should be able to deal with them as long as you plan ahead for the eventual possibility of, you know, a bunch of spiders climbing up your walls. So, moving on to the special units, we've got some proper big boys in the form of the Black Orcs. The Black Orcs, unlike most other units in the Greenskin army, is immune to animosity, as they are far more, well, disciplined than your normal orcs. The Black Orcs are essentially the professional soldiers of the Orcish race, and that does sound a little bit silly, considering that every orc is essentially a warrior. But you could essentially say that the Black Orcs are professional soldiers, proper, disciplined and trained soldiers, while the orcs themselves are essentially barbarian warriors, so to say. The Black Orcs are also extremely heavily armoured by orc standards, and can eat quite a bit of arrow fire without really giving too much of a shit. And should also come in units of 120, I think. They're not that powerful that they need to be in smaller units, but they are certainly one of the heavier elite infantries in the Warhammer world. They should come in two flavors, as far as a Total War game is concerned, with the basic version having swords and shields, or choppers and shields, and the other having two-handed weapons. Now, the sword and shield variety is of course there to be the brawling units that the Black Orcs are supposed to be. Black Orcs can not only survive a bunch of incoming arrow fire, meaning that they're a hell of a lot easier to get to the enemy than Savage Orcs, they are also considerably more skilled at the application of their weaponry, and the simple fact that they are tougher, bigger, stronger, and more heavily armored than normal orcs means that they are a unit that can stay in the fight for a long time indeed, and are excellent long-term grindy melee units. And should you choose to give them great weapons, or two-handed weapons, while they lose out on a fair bit of their grindiness because they're giving away their shields, they do gain a considerable strength boost, which means that they will be excellent for taking out units of elite heavy infantry with lots of heavy armor. Think Chaos Knights or Elite Empire and Bretonnian infantry, things that are armed essentially in full plate mail. Now, Black Orcs, I think, should be limited to 2 per army. simply because if big guns are rare, black orcs are like chicken teeth. However, I would like to see a special rule attached to them, so that in a normal army you can only have 2 units of black orcs. However, if your army is led by a black orc boss, which would be a fairly high level character, so if your character starts out as a normal orc boss, he has to level up quite a few times before he can select to become a black orc war boss. But if he gets to that point, then of course he's a black orc warboss. He's fought for a very long time, he's gained the respect of the black orcs, and can call upon considerably larger numbers on them, in which case you should be able to get maybe 3 times as many, giving you a total of 6 units of black orcs. Now they should still of course be pretty goddamn expensive, because ridiculously good, but still, that would give you an actual reason to choose a black orc warboss other than just him looking cool. Moving on, we have the Orc Boar Boys, your heavy cavalry. These are orcs riding giant boars, bred and, well, more or less trained for combat. Now, they aren't as heavily armored as much of the cavalry in the Warhammer world. They don't wear plate armor, and they don't wear magical chaos armor. However, they don't ride your average run-of-the-mill horses either, so these are big, badass orcs riding even bigger, more badass war boars. So while they don't have quite the staying power of heavily armored cavalry, they should have a considerable impact. They should be some of the heaviest cavalry in the Total War game on the charge, but they should be severely lacking in staying power. They also come in a savage orc boar boys flavor, which give away even more armor, turning them into practically light cavalry when it comes to protection, but the sheer insanity of their impact as you have a bunch of frenzied savage orcs mounted on extremely angry monstrous boars is truly something to behold. And if that wasn't enough love for the giant evil monster piggies, we have the Orc Boar Chariot. And really, what's not to love about this? It's a ramshackable chariot filled with orcs pulled by 2 giant-ass boars. As you can imagine, this relatively haphazard construction doesn't have a whole lot of staying power in a sustained melee, but god damn does it not hit like an absolute brick. And they should probably come in units of, I would probably say, 5? Or so, and be treated essentially as monsters with incredible charge bonuses, but not all that many hit points. So that if they don't break the unit they have charged, they're going to be in some fairly serious trouble. And of course, relatively vulnerable to ranged weapons, as although arrows are not going to be that much of a problem, some good crossbow bolts or black powder weaponry are probably going to be able to put the giant boars out of their lugging business, and thereby stop the chariot flat in its track. Now, you have a slightly different variety in the Goblin Wolf Chariot, which is much faster, much more agile, and a hell of a lot more fragile chariot option, much better for taking on light infantry and fast cavalry, as your orc boars are your break-in units for sending in against elite infantry that you need rid of. The Goblin Wolf Chariot should probably come in units twice the size. Actually, I think they should come in like 4 times the size of 20 chariots. They should be extremely fragile, extremely vulnerable to ranged weaponry, but being pretty damn fast and having a fair bit more protection than their Goblin Wolf Rider brethren, they would be a pretty damn potent unit for hunting down skirmishers and light cavalry, again if they can actually just catch the bastards. And of course they're a hell of a lot cheaper than Orc Boar Chariots. Next up we have the Squig Herd, one of the more unique special close combat units for the Orc and Goblin army. It is a herd of squigs. Now, what is a squig? Well, imagine a bouncy rubber ball, then give it more or less a sentient intelligence, fill it with teeth, and make it always hungry, and you've got pretty much a squig. Now imagine that this really angry, really hungry, and extremely toothy creature is about the size of a goblin, so about half as big as a human, and is bouncing towards you at an uncomfortable speed, and you've pretty much got the basics of a squig herd down. Now, they're not particularly disciplined, as I'm pretty sure you can judge by the picture. However, they are essentially herded towards the enemy in much the same way as war dogs are used in Total War, and in Total War, squig herds should pretty much be used in the same way, where the squigs themselves regenerate between battles as long as their goblin handlers aren't murdered. Now, contra to doggies, though, these things should have an incredible charge. They should hit like, well, a veritable ton of bricks, really, but they should also die out really bloody fast. They're kind of a shock unit, really. You send these guys in to hit the enemy ranks and just smash them apart, break up their formations a bit and cause them casualties, right before you hit them with your main wave of orc boys. Now, there is a slightly more controllable variety on the squig herd, which is the Night Goblin Squig Hoppers. Now, these are particularly large and angry squigs that are being ridden by particularly crazy night goblins. Now, whereas the goblins can form at least a partnership of mutual benefit with wolves, and the orcs can keep more or less the trust going with the boars, a night goblin that decides to ride a squig does so in the complete and full knowledge that if he ever falls off that squig, the squig is going to have his ass on a platter in seconds. So, if nothing else, they're pretty damn brave, or shitface on mushroom brew, 1 out of 2. In Total War terms, Night Goblin Squig Hoppers are a little bit hard to define. They're not heavy cavalry, but they're not really light cavalry either. So I'm actually at a little bit of a loss as to how to implement this unit. What I would probably do is to make them pretty slow with a really high charge. So it takes a while for them to get into combat. They're pretty damn vulnerable while they are getting into combat, but if they actually do manage to get a charge in, they should be relatively devastating. And should probably come in light cavalry sizes of about 80, because, well, they don't have any real armor, so if you dedicate a couple of units of archers to stopping these guys, you're probably going to succeed. So, yeah. I think probably that's my opinion on how to implement them. Though you could do some interesting things with them. Then, next up, everyone's favourite creature, the Snotlings. And yes, the Snotlings do in fact exist in the tabletop game. Being even smaller and weaker than goblins, they are, well, completely and utterly useless, really, for fighting. However, they are employed not as individual models, but as swarms, where every model is made up of several Snotlings. Now, these should be absolutely dirt cheap, and come in units of 240, where I'm thinking that every single unit, so every single model of those 240, should probably be 2 or 3 smaller models again, so they should come in absolutely massive numbers, but be essentially worthless for fighting, to the point where I'm kinda thinking that they might just ignore putting them in the game, because they don't really serve much of a purpose. They're too small to really be able to eat up much arrow fire. No enemy worth his salt is going to waste artillery fire on them. And while they could be decent enough flank guards just eating a charge, like, you would rather have goblins do that, simply because the goblins might actually inflict some casualties, while the Snotlings, well, they're essentially just speed bumps. So yeah, I'm a bit iffy on this unit. Not a huge fan of them myself, except of course for pets. Now, something far more interesting than the little Snotlings though is of course trolls. Big, strong, and relatively cheap means that you can have quite a few of them. And they are of course pretty damn powerful in close combat, and since they can regenerate, the fact that they don't have any armor doesn't really bother them as much, as any units of arrows or crossbowmen pointed towards them is not going to cause that much damage. They've also got a fair bit of staying power in melee combat due to their regenerative abilities. Now, in total war terms, I think they should probably be in units of 60, where they would be the rough equivalent of ogres. Except I would like for them to have a on-the-charge ranged weapon, which would be their vomit. When they charge, the front rank just lets out a stream of acidy vomit that causes some proper damage to the unit they're charging, which could be a cool and very much so fluff-correct thing for them to do. Otherwise, they are simply large, tough, powerful melee combatants with a considerable amount of staying power. However, there's a catch. Trolls are stupid. Very, very, very stupid. In tabletop, this means that every now and then a unit of trolls that doesn't have an orc leader nearby to keep an eye on them and issue their orders again if they should prove to have missed the first round of orders, sometimes just simply stand around looking stupidly at whatever has caught their fancy. I'd like for this to be implemented in Total War to the point where, if you've got a unit of trolls, sometimes they will simply just ignore orders unless you've got an orcish general, or, well, a leader of some sort, close enough by, in the same way that animosity works, essentially. Again, I wouldn't be hugely disappointed if they decided to ignore this, but, flavor, you know, I'd like it. So, onto some actual war machines. Now, we'll stay in the special units section for the first one, being the Goblin Spear Chucker. And this is nothing special, really. It's a ballista. It should work just like any ballista has ever worked in Total War before. Except, of course, it is crewed by goblins, so it's not going to be particularly accurate, but yeah, it's essentially just a ballista, and should come in units of, I would actually say 8. Give the Goblin Spear Chuckers a unit of 8, and just give them really, really low accuracy. Now, for the rest of the war machines, we move up to the rare units section, where we have the rock lobber. Again, this is a pretty standard contraption. It's a simple catapult that flings nice big rocks. Great for beating up large units of monsters, or particularly large and evil creatures, thinking dragons, hydras, manticores, you know, demon princes. Because even if you're a demon prince, a giant rock to the face is probably going to ruin your day. In Total War terms, they should work pretty much like any other catapult, or, well, trebuchet if you so desire, and should come in units of 4 without any real specialness to them. They're just catapults. However, they are at least supervised by an orc, so they should be relatively accurate by, well, you know, catapult standards. Then we've got the Goblin Doom Diver, which is a brilliant little unit, to say the absolute least. And this, you would be excused for thinking, was another just a ballista, except it fights goblins. Well, who cares? It's essentially still just a ballista. However, here's the interesting little thing about it. That little goblin, as you can see, has got a pair of wings attached to him, which allows him to actually steer where he's going. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call this smart ammunition, but at least he has more control over his trajectory than a rock has. Which means that they're actually one of the most accurate war machines in the Warhammer world, as the projectile, you know, it can steer itself. So this should essentially be a unit consisting of 4 of these Goblin Doom Divers that would function essentially like ballistas, but they should have really, really good accuracy, as to the point where they will practically never miss, and they should probably have a bit more of an impact than your average ballista. Not so much because the projectile is actually all that much larger, but just to reflect the fact that it's a fairly powerful weapon within the Warhammer tabletop game. Then we have the good old giants. The old reliable giants. Again, I've talked about giants before, so I won't touch upon them too much here, but Well, essentially they should be single model units with probably just AoE attacks, smashing things with their clubs, relatively simple creatures, pretty damn good for taking on big scary enemy units a la dragons etc, as a giant can hit a dragon pretty damn hard in the head with his club and put at least a pause to the dragon's further rampaging actions towards your army. So, moving quickly on, we have the Mangler Squigs. Essentially massive squigs that have been prodded by night goblins until they are even more batshit insane than they normally are. In many ways they should work pretty much like a squig herd, except they should be, well, bigger and more dangerous essentially. Working in much the same way in that they are pretty damn, well, easy to kill with ranged weapons, having no armor, but they should have an absolutely insane impact and be killed off relatively quickly in melee combat after doing a ton of charge damage. Then there's the Snotling pump wagon. Completely and utterly unreliable chariots, essentially, to the point where it has random movements and it moves in a random direction, and although it has quite a decent impact, well, it hits like a ton of bricks, the unreliability of the Snotling pump wagon is such that in a total war game I'd kinda like for them to just not do it. Because if you're gonna do it justice and make it into an actual Snotling pump wagon, it would be so damn random that you would never actually want to use the thing. It works okay in tabletop, kind of, because there are much smaller units around and the scale itself is smaller. Putting this thing in a big-ass, for example, 40 on 40 unit battle? I'm not convinced, really. I'd kind of like them to just ignore this one. Just because it's such a strange unit, and normally I'd say strange is good, but in this case, something this bloody unreliable is probably going to be pretty hard and pretty silly to implement in a total war game. But hey, maybe the guys over at Creative Assembly will impress me and find a way to implement it properly and still make it a pump wagon. I hope they do, but I'm not holding my breath. So, for the last unit of the Orc and Goblin army, I've saved the biggest and the best for last, the Arachnarok Spider. Well, what is there to say about the Arachnarok Spider? It is a massive-ass spider, with goblins riding on it. Being a spider, of course, it can ignore terrain, so again, I'd bloody love to see this thing in a siege map, because while a bunch of goblin spider riders might be relatively easy to clean off your walls, this thing would be considerably more interesting to get out once it's gotten in. Now, the Arachnarok Spider in and of itself is not quite as tough and dangerous as it looks. It is a relatively squishy creature for its size. And of course, being this big, it's a pretty large pulsating bullseye for your enemy to fire at. So I think it should probably come in units of 2, with a ton of charge potential of course, because well, it's still a massive ass spider. And reasonable melee. I mean, a unit of this, consisting of 2 models, should definitely be able to run off your standard infantry units, certainly. And you should probably even be able to fight heavy cavalry as long as it gets to charge them relatively well. But it's not going to be taking on a unit of ogres, it's not going to be eating multiple cannonballs. So it's a bit of a squishy monstrosity. So you could kind of use it as we do elephants in current Total War, kind of. Except they should be a lot tougher than your average elephant, thereby the unit of 2. And you could give them some of the special things it has in tabletop. For example, first and foremost, it's ridden by a bunch of goblins, which of course are firing some token ranged weapons, some arrows firing off it, not going to have much of an impact in a total wargame. But you can also mount a wizard on it, which, while not being ideal for actually having him perform the tasks of a wizard, as well you want a wizard to be, protected and casting spells, it could be a really cool thing where if you upgrade the Arachnarok Spider to have a goblin shaman riding it, it gets a on-the-charge missile weapon. Basically, the Goblin Shaman just throws out a bunch of magic that hits the unit that charge, doing a bit of additional range damage before the spider hits home. Or you could put a spider web lobber on top of it, which is essentially a catapult, except a much weaker one, which should be able to fire on the move, giving you a bit more oomph to your ranged phase and giving you a bit more of a use for the Arachnarok spider. Of course, you don't want this thing to be sitting back and firing all game, because if it does, it's probably going to get targeted by artillery and other things that are going to smush it pretty damn quickly. But it's a nice potential upgrade just to get a little bit of extra range damage in there before the unit hits home. So, that has been all of the units for the Orcs and Goblins army. As to how they fight as an army, I will touch upon that in my tactics video, so please look forward to that. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.